Hello everyone and welcome to my presentation, Distinctly Diverse, a survey of evidence for the Aboriginal migration into Australia. Aboriginal Australians are one of the oldest continuous civilizations in the world. Current estimates have the migration into Australia dated as far back as 80,000 years. Due to geographic isolation, they are genetically and linguistically distinct from any other population in the world. But being distinct does not render them homologous. There is more genetic variation between northern and southern Australians than between Siberians and their Native American cousins. This presentation serves to give an overview of this unique variation and how it came to be. Our first line of evidence is the geologic history on how they became geographically isolated. 74,000 years ago, the Mount Toba supereruption plunged the world into a volcanic winter. This led to the growth of glacial ice in the upper and lower latitudes. Consequently, the sea level around the world dropped by as much as 70 meters. This drop in sea levels led to more land masses being exposed. One of these land masses connected to the northern portion of Australia, extending its coastline to within 100 kilometers of the nearest island. This ancient continent is known as Sahul. At the end of the last ice age, around 10,000 years ago, sea levels began to rise again, separating Aboriginal Australians from their Papuan cousins, creating a genetically, linguistically, and culturally distinct population. Now that we have an understanding of the setting, we can begin to explore the evidence. Underwater archaeology is a relatively recent endeavor, and thus has a limited data set. Using remote sensing methods such as side-scan sonar and aerial drone surveys, archaeologists are attempting to find sites along the former coastline of Sahul. Over 700 artifacts have been found from 2 different sites near islands off the northern coast of Australia and have been dated to a minimum age of 8,500 before present. The success of these findings has led to great interest in underwater archaeology near the ancient coastlines of Sahul. Using Bayesian predictive modeling will hopefully increase the number and frequency of the sites found. The submergence of Sahul cut ancient Aborigines off from the diffusive influences on their language for thousands of years. Over the past 10,000 years, their language groups have become completely distinct from any other linguistic family. In fact, due to the sheer inhospitable distance between northern and southern Australia, they have also developed many distinct languages of their own. While language may be a symbolic representation of thought, it is not the only mechanism for expressing our thoughts. For a long time, it was thought that human migration was the sole mechanism for the extinction of the megafauna in Australia. That belief is being challenged by a controversial theory. The theory suggests that ancient rock art depicts megafaunal animals, including giant flightless birds and the marsupial lion, among others. This new perspective coincides with the oral traditions of the Aboriginal people. Imagine that. The controversy stems from the idea that the works of art are symbolic depictions of spiritual creatures or ancestral beings. However, this idea does not seem to match up with the known descriptions of these types of entities, since these drawings do not have exaggerated or abstract forms. It is believed that they depict animals and scenes that were familiar to the artists. One of the problems with identifying these artistic depictions is that it seems to have been common practice in the region to draw over existing artwork. Another issue is the relative absence of megafauna in the fossil record of Australia. Even with these issues, some of these drawings show an uncanny resemblance to the fossil reconstructions that we do have. Unfortunately, none of the rock art sites in Australia have been able to be dated yet. With the extinction of the megafauna taking place 40 to 50,000 years ago, these drawings would have to be at least that old. There is evidence of rock art lasting at least 40,000 years. Just to the north in Sulawesi, there is a hand stencil that was dated to a minimum age of 39,900 years. If the artistic depictions in the Arnhem Land are of megafauna, then they are easily the oldest works of art on the planet. Some of the strongest evidence for the ancient migration into Australia comes from genetics. The out of Africa theory states that our ancestors migrated out of Africa and slowly dispersed around the globe. Haplogroup and gene mutation analysis have allowed us to date the genetic divergence of geographically separate populations. From this, we know that the Papuan and Australian progenitors became genetically distinct around 58,000 years ago and diverged from each other 37,000 years ago. The best genetic evidence we have comes from the sequencing of a 100-year-old lock of hair donated by an Aboriginal man with no European admixture. By comparing this sequence to both modern DNA and other ancient sequences, it was found that Aboriginal ancestors split off from their Eurasian population between 62 to 75,000 years ago. When compared to the European and Asian populations split 25 to 38,000 years ago, we can see that the Aborigines are the oldest continuous genetic population outside of sub-Saharan Africa. A second wave of migration seems to have mixed with and displaced most other populations in Eurasia, leaving Australians genetically distinct. The last and possibly the most interesting find was that up to 4% of Aboriginal DNA stems from an unknown hominin. The oldest and most abundant evidence we have for the initial Australian migration are the thousands of artifacts found in Kakadu National Park. The Majabebe rock shelter has been excavated 4 times since the 1970s, but the most recent one has been the most profound, not only because of its discoveries, but also because of the inclusive nature of the project with the native Murar people. Before the project began, researchers hammered out an unprecedented agreement with the locals for being allowed to excavate and make these incredible discoveries. The Murar would retain complete control over the dig and of all of the artifacts that were found. While adding to the scientific knowledge base, the scientists would also be adding to their cultural history and confirming the oral traditions of how long Aborigines had inhabited the land there. In total, nearly 11,000 artifacts were unearthed, including the oldest unbroken ground-edged axe ever found. Researchers were able to create an assemblage of these stone axes covering thousands of years of technological progress. They stated that while there were telltale similarities throughout, there was also a huge variety of them and remarkable changes over time. Using a combination of radiocarbon dating and optically stimulated luminescence, the researchers were able to determine a minimum age for the oldest artifacts at 65,000 years. Some estimated dates, based on stratigraphy, ranged all the way up to 80,000 years. Those numbers may not be accurate due to the small chance of geologic shifting, although there was no evidence for this in the area. 65,000 years seems to be the most concrete date for a sustained population, as the layer dated to this time frame was a dense occupation layer. With a 95% chance of people making their first forays into this area 70,000 plus years ago, and it being densely populated by 65,000 years ago, both the Murar people and the scientific community are watching for the results of the ongoing systematic surveys of the area. This was by no means an all-encompassing look at all of the evidence, but I hope that I was able to convey the breadth and depth of history of this migration and the Aboriginal people. I look forward to the future of archaeology in this region, as I am sure that in time it will continue to yield astounding new evidence. The evidence we currently have points to a singular conclusion. The Aboriginal people of Australia are an utterly unique example of distinct diversity.